So here's a thought experiment for you. Picture a map of the world. Got it? Now picture that same map from, say, 1900. It looks different, right? Borders are wiggly in other places, names are unfamiliar, entire empires sprawl across continents where now dozens of smaller nations exist. Did you know that several countries vanished from the map in the last century? And I don't just mean they changed their names like how Siam became Thailand. I mean they ceased to exist as sovereign entities. They were absorbed, they shattered, they merged, they were fundamentally redrawn into something entirely new. It's a powerful and sometimes tragic reminder that the world we inhabit is not static. It's a living, breathing, constantly shifting organism. And that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to delve into the stories behind these phantom nations, these ghosts on the geopolitical stage. The 20th century, with its world wars, ideological clashes, and waves of decolonization, was a particularly brutal and transformative time for the world map. It was a crucible that melted down old empires and forged new nations from the molten slag of history. Understanding how and why these countries disappeared isn't just a quirky historical exercise, it tells us so much about the forces that continue to shape our world today. Forces like nationalism, imperialism, and the complex, often messy, quest for self-determination. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a historical world tour of phantoms and memories. We'll count down the top 10 countries that disappeared in the 20th century, exploring the how, the why, and the what came after for each. From vast multi-ethnic empires to tiny island nations, their stories are a testament to the fact that on the grand stage of history, nothing, not even the lines on a map, is permanent. Let's get started. Kicking off our list at number 10 is a real heavyweight of European history, a sprawling multi-ethnic empire that was for a time the heart of the continent, Austria-Hungary. Formed in 1867 through the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, this dual monarchy was a peculiar political beast. It wasn't one country but two, the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, governed by a single monarch from the venerable House of Habsburg. It was a place of incredible cultural vibrancy, giving us figures like Sigmund Freud, Gustav Klimt, and Franz Kafka. Vienna was the glittering jewel of an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians. But beneath this glittering surface, the empire was a pressure cooker of nationalist tensions. Think about it, you had Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and Ukrainians all living under one imperial roof. Each group harbored its own distinct cultural identity, language, and, increasingly, its own aspirations for self-governance. The Habsburg rulers tried to manage this delicate balancing act, but it was like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle on a tightrope. The rise of nationalism across Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries was a fire, and Austria-Hungary was a tinderbox. The spark, as we all know, came on June 28, 1914 in Sarajevo, a city within the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia. The assassination of the heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, by a Serbian nationalist, ignited the July Crisis, which in turn cascaded into the cataclysm of World War I. The very conflict that Austria-Hungary helped to start would be the instrument of its own complete and utter destruction. The war wasn't just fought on the battlefield, it was fought on the home front, where food shortages, military losses, and political dissent ripped the empire apart from the inside. For 4 years, the empire bled men and resources onto the battlefields of the Eastern and Italian fronts. By 1918, it was exhausted, broken, and facing total collapse. The various ethnic groups, sensing the moment of their liberation, began to declare their independence one by one. The Czechs and Slovaks formed Czechoslovakia, the South Slavs joined with Serbia to create what would become Yugoslavia, and Hungary itself declared its own independence, formally dissolving the union with Austria. The empire simply ceased to be. The end came officially in November 1918. The last Habsburg emperor, Charles I, relinquished his powers, refusing to abdicate in the hope of a future restoration that would never come. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye and the Treaty of Trianon, signed after the war, formally carved up the empire's territory among its successor states and its neighbors. What was once a great European power was reduced to the small, landlocked Republic of Austria and a diminished Kingdom of Hungary. And so, Austria-Hungary vanished from the map, but its ghost haunts Europe to this day. The borders drawn in its wake would become the source of new conflicts, and the unresolved nationalist questions it left behind would fester and contribute to the outbreak of another world war just 2 decades later. Its dissolution was a textbook example of how a massive, seemingly permanent political structure can crumble under the immense pressure of war and the irresistible force of nationalism. From one crumbling empire to another, we arrive at number 9, the Ottoman Empire. If Austria-Hungary was a European heavyweight, the Ottoman Empire was an intercontinental titan. For over 600 years, it was a dominant force, bridging Europe, Asia, and Africa. At its zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent, it controlled vast territories, from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf and across North Africa. Its capital, Constantinople, or Istanbul, was one of the world's great cities, a crossroads of civilizations, trade, and ideas. But by the dawn of the 20th century, the once mighty empire was famously known as the sick man of Europe. It had been in a state of slow, steady decline for centuries, plagued by military defeats, economic stagnation, and the same nationalist fevers that were gripping Austria-Hungary. Its territories in the Balkans had broken away one by one throughout the 19th century to form new nations like Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria. The empire was hemorrhaging land and influence, and its leadership struggled to implement reforms that could hold the rickety structure together. The final blow, much like with our previous entry, was World War I. The Ottoman leadership, led by a triumvirate known as the Three Pashas, made the fateful decision to ally with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. This decision pitted the empire against the Allies, including Britain, France, and Russia, who had long coveted Ottoman territories. The war was a disaster for the Ottomans. They fought brutal campaigns in the Caucasus against Russia, in Mesopotamia against the British, and most famously at Gallipoli, where they repelled an Allied invasion but at a staggering cost. Internally, the war years were marked by immense suffering and horror, most notably the Armenian genocide, in which the Ottoman government systematically exterminated an estimated 1.5 million Armenians. This atrocity, along with the broader brutalities of the war, shattered the multi-ethnic fabric of the empire. By 1918, with its allies defeated and its own armies in tatters, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively surrendering to the Allies. The once great empire was now at the mercy of its conquerors. The victorious Allies moved to partition the empire's lands, as outlined in secret agreements made during the war. But this foreign occupation sparked a new, powerful wave of resistance from within what was left of the empire's Turkish heartland. This was the Turkish War of Independence, a nationalist uprising led by a brilliant and charismatic army officer named Mustafa Kemal. He rallied the Turkish people against both the occupying Allied forces and the collaborationist Ottoman government in Istanbul. Mustafa Kemal's nationalist forces were ultimately victorious. They drove out the foreign armies and, in a radical break with the past, abolished the Ottoman Sultanate in November 1922, ending 623 years of imperial rule. The last sultan fled into exile and the Ottoman Empire was officially consigned to the history books. In its place on the Anatolian Peninsula, Mustafa Kemal, who would become known as Ataturk, or Father of the Turks, proclaimed the new secular Republic of Turkey in 1923, a modern nation-state rising from the ashes of an ancient empire. Our next vanished country brings us forward in time, into the heart of the Cold War. At number 8, we have the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, better known to the world as East Germany. This country didn't collapse from centuries of decline. It was born from the ashes of World War II and existed for just over 40 years, a geopolitical creation whose entire lifespan was defined by the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. Its story is inseparable from the division of Germany and the iconic symbol of that division, the Berlin Wall. After Germany's defeat in 1945, the country and its capital, Berlin, were divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allies, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. As tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviets escalated into the Cold War, this temporary division became permanent. In 1949, the 3 Western zones merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. In response, the Soviet Union established the German Democratic Republic in its zone a few months later. Germany was now 2 countries. Life in East Germany was defined by its political system, a one-party socialist state under the tight control of the Soviet Union. The economy was centrally planned, private industry was nationalized, and political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed by the infamous secret police, the Stasi. For many of its citizens, it was a life of limited freedom and constant surveillance. Yet it wasn't all grim. The state provided guaranteed employment, free healthcare and education, and East Germany achieved a certain level of economic stability and even sporting success, particularly in the Olympics. The most glaring problem for the GDR was that its citizens kept leaving. Throughout the 1950s, millions of East Germans seeking political freedom and economic opportunity fled to the West, often through the open border in the city of Berlin. This brain drain was a demographic and propaganda disaster for the communist regime. Their solution was drastic and brutal. In August 1961, they constructed the Berlin Wall, a concrete and barbed wire barrier that physically sealed East Berlin from West Berlin, turning the country into a virtual prison. The wall became the most potent symbol of the Iron Curtain. For decades, East Germany stood as a key satellite state of the Soviet bloc. But by the late 1980s, the foundations of that bloc were cracking. The reformist policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, combined with growing economic stagnation and popular discontent, created an unstoppable momentum for change. Throughout 1989, mass protests erupted across East Germany. The final almost surreal moment came on November 9, 1989, when a confused government official mistakenly announced that East Germans were free to cross the border. That night, euphoric crowds swarmed the Berlin Wall, met by equally joyous West Berliners. People climbed the wall, danced on it, and chipped away at it with hammers and chisels. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the symbolic end of the Cold War in Europe. With the barrier gone, the question of reunification became inevitable. After a whirlwind of negotiations, the German Democratic Republic was formally dissolved, and its territory was absorbed into the Federal Republic of Germany on October 3, 1990. After 41 years apart, Germany was one again. Number 7, Yugoslavia, 1918 to 1992. Coming in at number 7 is a country whose name became, well, pretty much synonymous with brutal, fratricidal conflict in the 1990s. Yugoslavia. The story of Yugoslavia is really the story of an idea. The idea that the South Slavic peoples, the Yugoslavs including Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, and Montenegrins, could actually live together in a single unified state. This idea was first realized in 1918, right after World War I and the collapse of Austria-Hungary, with the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which was renamed Yugoslavia in 1929. From its very beginning, the new kingdom was dominated by the Serbs, and, that created some pretty deep resentment among the other ethnic groups, especially the Croats. These tensions simmered for a while, and then exploded during World War II, when the Axis powers invaded and basically tore Yugoslavia apart. The war devolved into a horrific multi-sided civil war, with collaborationist regimes, royalist partisans, and communist partisans all fighting against both the occupiers and each other. It was a period of unimaginable violence that left deep scars on the collective psyche of the region. But out of this chaos, a powerful and unifying figure emerged. The communist leader, Josip Broz, better known as Tito. His partisans were the most effective resistance force, and after the war, he re-established Yugoslavia as a socialist federal republic. For the next 35 years, Tito ruled Yugoslavia with an iron fist. He masterfully suppressed nationalist sentiments under the banner of brotherhood and unity. He also famously broke with Stalin's Soviet Union, charting a non-aligned course during the Cold War that gave Yugoslavia a really unique and prestigious position on the world stage. Under Tito, Yugoslavia experienced decades of relative peace and honestly economic prosperity. It was a federation of 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces, each with its own identity, but all held together by Tito's personal authority and a pretty complex system of power sharing. The problem was that the entire system was built around just one man. As long as Tito was alive, those simmering nationalist resentments were kept in check. But, a lot of people wondered what would happen once the great unifier was gone. Tito died in 1980, and the answer came pretty swiftly. Without his leadership, the country began to unravel. A severe economic crisis in the 1980s only made the old ethnic tensions worse. Ambitious and cynical nationalist leaders like Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and Franjo Tudjman in Croatia rose to power by stoking the flames of ethnic hatred and historical grievances. The federal institutions weakened, and the republic started pulling in different directions, reasserting their own interests over the Yugoslav ideal. The final violent breakup began in 1991. Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, leading to a brief war in Slovenia and a much more brutal war in Croatia. The following year, Bosnia and Herzegovina also declared independence, plunging that multi-ethnic republic into the deadliest European conflict since World War II, marked by ethnic cleansing and the siege of Sarajevo. By 1992, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia had, well, pretty much ceased to exist, splintering into a collection of warring states. The dream of a unified South Slav nation had died in a nightmare of violence. Number 6, Czechoslovakia, 1918 to 1992. At number 6, we find a country whose disappearance honestly stands in stark contrast to the violent disintegration of Yugoslavia. I'm talking about Czechoslovakia, a nation born from the ashes of Austria-Hungary that split apart in one of the most peaceful and, well, orderly national divorces in modern history. Its story is a fascinating tale of two closely related peoples, the Czechs and the Slovaks, whose shared statehood ultimately gave way to a desire for separate national paths, a process that became known as the Velvet Divorce. Like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia was a product of the post-World War I settlement, founded in 1918 on the principles of self-determination championed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. It brought together the Czech lands of Bohemia and Moravia with Slovakia, which had long been under Hungarian rule. Led by its revered founder and first president Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, interwar Czechoslovakia was a beacon of democracy and industrial prosperity in Central Europe, kind of a stable island in a sea of rising authoritarianism. However, the country's existence was always pretty precarious. It was home to a large and restive German minority in a region called the Sudetenland. In 1938, Adolf Hitler used the pretext of protecting this minority to demand the region's annexation. The infamous Munich Agreement, where Britain and France appeased Hitler by sacrificing Czechoslovakia, really sealed the country's fate. It was dismembered and then occupied by Nazi Germany, disappearing from the map for the duration of World War II. After the war, Czechoslovakia was reconstituted, but its freedom was sadly short-lived. In 1948, a Soviet-backed coup brought the Communist Party to power, and the country was pulled firmly behind the Iron Curtain. For the next 4 decades, it was a satellite state of the USSR. A brief period of liberalization in 1968, known as the Prague Spring, was brutally crushed by a Warsaw Pact invasion, a traumatic event that entrenched a hardline communist regime for another 20 years. The end of communist rule came suddenly and peacefully in 1989. Inspired by the fall of the Berlin Wall, massive student-led demonstrations in Prague swelled into a nationwide movement. In what became known as the Velvet Revolution, the communist government collapsed without a single shot being fired. The dissident playwright Václav Havel was triumphantly elected president, and Czechoslovakia was free once more. But this newfound freedom soon exposed the old underlying tensions between the Czechs and the Slovaks. While the two groups were linguistically and culturally similar, they had different historical experiences, economic structures, and political priorities. The more industrialized Czech part of the country, led by Václav Klaus, favored rapid free market reforms. The more rural Slovak part, led by Vladimir Mečiar, preferred a slower pace of change. Political disagreements between the two leaders escalated, and it became clear that they had fundamentally different visions for the future of the federal state. Rather than let these disagreements fester, they decided on an amicable separation. And so, on January 1, 1993, Czechoslovakia peacefully dissolved. There were no referendums, no wars, no violence. It was a decision made by political leaders and carried out with honestly remarkable civility. The country split into two new independent nations, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The Velvet Divorce, as it was aptly named, showed the world that national separation didn't have to be violent, offering a hopeful counterpoint to the tragic events unfolding in the former Yugoslavia at the exact same time. Number 5. The Soviet Union, 1922 to 1991. We've reached the halfway point, and at number 5 is the big one. the superpower whose collapse fundamentally redrew the map of the world and ended an entire historical era. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, the Soviet Union. For nearly 70 years it was one of the two poles of global power, a vast Eurasian empire stretching across 11 time zones from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Its disappearance wasn't just the end of a country, it was the end of the Cold War and the global communist project. The Soviet Union was forged in the crucible of the 1917 Russian Revolution, which overthrew the centuries-old Tsarist autocracy. Led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, the world's first communist state was officially established in 1922. It was envisioned as a voluntary union of socialist republics, but in reality it was a highly centralized state controlled from Moscow by the Communist Party. Under Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, the country underwent brutal, rapid industrialization and collectivization, all enforced by a reign of terror that consumed millions of lives. Despite its horrific internal violence, the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as a global superpower. The Red Army's role in defeating Nazi Germany was decisive, but it came at an almost unimaginable cost of some 27 million Soviet lives. In the aftermath of the war, the USSR established a buffer zone of satellite states in Eastern Europe, creating the Iron Curtain and setting the stage for the 4-decade-long Cold War against the United States and its Western allies. This ideological and geopolitical struggle dominated the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War was a period of intense rivalry, defined by the nuclear arms race, the space race, proxy wars around the globe, and a battle for hearts and minds. The Soviet Union projected an image of immense power, with its massive military, its scientific achievements like sending the first man into space, and its influence over communist movements worldwide. But behind this facade, the system was rotting from within. The centrally planned economy was notoriously inefficient, unable to produce quality consumer goods or keep pace with Western technological innovation. The beginning of the end came in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Recognizing the deep systemic problems, he initiated a radical program of reforms, glasnost, or openness, which allowed for greater freedom of speech and political dissent, and perestroika, or restructuring, which aimed to revitalize the stagnant economy. But these reforms, intended to save the Soviet system, instead unleashed forces that Gorbachev just could not control. Glasnost allowed long-suppressed nationalist movements in the various Soviet republics to finally find their voice. The momentum became unstoppable. In 1989, the satellite states of Eastern Europe broke away. Then, the Soviet republics themselves began to demand sovereignty. A failed coup attempt by communist hardliners in August 1991 fatally weakened Gorbachev's authority and, honestly, accelerated the collapse. One by one, the republics declared their independence. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The red hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and the Soviet Union was formally dissolved, fracturing into 15 independent nations, including Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. For number 4, we journey to the rooftop of the world to discuss a nation whose status remains a deeply contentious and emotional issue to this day, Tibet. Unlike the other countries on our list that dissolved through war, revolution, or mutual agreement, Tibet's disappearance from the map of independent nations came through annexation by a powerful neighbor. For centuries, Tibet existed as a unique Buddhist kingdom, a land of monasteries and mountains, largely isolated from the rest of the world and ruled by a line of spiritual and temporal leaders known as the Dalai Lamas. Tibet's history as a distinct political entity is long and complex, stretching back to the 7th century. For long periods, it was a powerful empire in its own right. In later centuries, its relationship with its powerful neighbor China was often one of ambiguity. Chinese dynasties sometimes claimed suzerainty, a kind of loose political authority, over Tibet, while Tibetans maintained that their relationship with the Chinese emperor was one of a spiritual teacher to a patron, not a subject to a ruler. In practice, from the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912 until 1950, Tibet functioned as a de facto independent state, with its own government, army, currency, and postal system. This period of independence came to an abrupt end with the victory of the Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, and the new government soon turned its attention to its western borders. The communists viewed Tibet not as an independent nation, but as an integral part of China that needed to be liberated from what they called a feudal, theocratic system and foreign imperialist influence. In October 1950, troops from the People's Liberation Army crossed into Tibetan territory, easily overwhelming the small, poorly equipped Tibetan army. The international community, preoccupied with the Korean War and reluctant to challenge the new Chinese government, offered little to no support. Faced with a full-scale invasion, the Tibetan government, led by a teenage 14th Dalai Lama, was forced to negotiate. In 1951, Tibetan delegates, under duress in Beijing, signed the 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. This agreement recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, but promised to maintain the existing political system and the status of the Dalai Lama, and to protect religious freedom. In essence, it formalized the annexation of Tibet into the People's Republic of China. For the next several years, the Chinese government and the traditional Tibetan government coexisted in an uneasy truce. However, Chinese rule became increasingly repressive, with policies aimed at dismantling Tibet's traditional social and religious structures. Resentment boiled over into a massive popular uprising in the capital, Lhasa, in 1959. The Chinese army brutally crushed the rebellion, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of Tibetans. Fearing for his life, the Dalai Lama, along with some 80,000 followers, made a perilous journey across the Himalayas to seek asylum in India, where he established a government in exile. With the flight of its leader and the end of its autonomy, Tibet's existence as a distinct political entity on the world map was over. Number 3. Sikkim from 1642 to 1975. At number 3, we have another Himalayan kingdom whose story echoes that of Tibet, albeit with a different and less violent conclusion: the Kingdom of Sikkim. Tucked away between Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet and India, Sikkim was a tiny Buddhist monarchy that managed to maintain its existence for over 300 years. Its story is a classic example of how a small buffer state can ultimately be absorbed by a much larger and more powerful neighbor, a process driven by geopolitics, internal politics, and the democratic aspirations of its people. The kingdom was founded in 1642 by the Chogyal, or righteous ruler, of the Namgyal dynasty. For most of its history, Sikkim navigated a delicate path, balancing its relationships with the powers surrounding it. First Tibet, then the British Empire in India, and finally, independent India. In the 19th century, it became a protectorate of British India, ceding control of its foreign affairs and defense to the British in exchange for autonomy in its internal matters. This arrangement continued after India gained its independence in 1947. Sikkim in the mid-20th century was a society in transition. The ruling Chogyal and the traditional Buddhist elite were largely of Tibetan Bhutia Lepcha origin, while the majority of the population was now composed of ethnic Nepalis, who had migrated to the kingdom over the previous century. This demographic shift created political tensions, as the growing Nepali majority began to demand greater democratic rights and representation, challenging the authority of the monarchy. The situation came to a head in the early 1970s. India, under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, was growing increasingly concerned about Sikkim's strategic location. It bordered China, with whom India had fought a war in 1962. The Chogyal, Palden Thondup Namgyal, and his American-born wife, Hope Cook, were seen by New Delhi as pushing for greater independence, a move that India feared could create an unstable and potentially pro-Chinese state on its sensitive northern border. India began to actively support the pro-democracy, anti-monarchy political parties within Sikkim. In 1973, massive anti-monarchy demonstrations erupted, and the Chogyal's palace was surrounded. The Indian army intervened at the Chogyal's request to restore order, but this intervention effectively stripped him of his remaining power. India drafted a new constitution for Sikkim that reduced the Chogyal to a figurehead and gave immense power to an elected legislature which was dominated by the pro-Indian Sikkim National Congress Party. The end was now just a formality. In 1975, the Prime Minister of Sikkim, who was backed by India, accused the Chogyal of obstructing the new democratic government. Indian troops moved in, disarmed the palace guards, and placed the Chogyal under house arrest. The Sikkim parliament, in a move orchestrated by India, quickly passed a bill declaring the monarchy abolished and Sikkim a constituent state of India. A referendum was hastily organized to ratify the decision. With the monarchy suppressed and Indian influence pervasive, the result was a foregone conclusion, an overwhelming and controversial vote in favor of merging with India. On May 16, 1975, the Kingdom of Sikkim officially ceased to exist and became the 22nd state of India. Our runner-up at number 2 is a country that was born from, defined by, and ultimately consumed by the Cold War, the Republic of Vietnam, better known as South Vietnam. For 20 years it was the front line in the global struggle against communism, a nation propped up by the United States and fighting for its very existence against its northern counterpart. Its fall in 1975 was a traumatic event, not just for its own people, but for its American allies, marking a bitter end to one of the most divisive wars in United States history. South Vietnam's origins lie in the end of French colonial rule in Indochina. After the French were defeated by Vietnamese communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the Geneva Accords temporarily partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North was to be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communists, while the South would be a non-communist state. The plan was to hold nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but these elections never happened. The United States, fearing a communist victory, threw its support behind an anti-communist nationalist leader in the South, Ngo Dinh Diem. In 1955, Diem established the Republic of Vietnam, with Saigon as its capital, and refused to participate in the reunification elections. From that point on, the two Vietnams were on a collision course. South Vietnam was plagued by instability from the start. Diem's government was corrupt, authoritarian, and alienated large segments of the population, particularly the Buddhist majority. Meanwhile, communist-backed insurgents, known as the Viet Cong, began a guerrilla campaign to destabilize the South and reunify the country by force, with ever-increasing support from North Vietnam. Fearing the domino effect, the idea that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian countries would follow, the United States steadily increased its involvement. What began with a few military advisors under President Eisenhower escalated into a full-scale military intervention under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. By the late 1960s, over 500,000 American troops were on the ground in South Vietnam, fighting alongside the South Vietnamese Army in a brutal and complex war. Despite massive American firepower, the United States and South Vietnam were unable to defeat the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. The 1968 Tet Offensive, though a military failure for the Communists, was a huge psychological and political victory, turning American public opinion decisively against the war. The United States began a policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing its troops while building up the South Vietnamese military to fight on its own. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, leading to a complete U.S. withdrawal. Left to fend for itself, South Vietnam could not survive. Its government was still corrupt, and its military, despite being well-equipped, suffered from poor morale and leadership. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched its final, massive offensive. The South Vietnamese army collapsed with stunning speed. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The city fell, South Vietnam surrendered unconditionally, and the war was over. The iconic images of desperate Vietnamese civilians trying to board American helicopters on the roof of the U.S. Embassy became a lasting symbol of the country's tragic demise. South Vietnam had vanished, and the country was officially reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And so we arrive at number 1 on our list of countries that vanished in the 20th century. This one might be a surprise, as its disappearance was not through war or collapse, but through a union that created a new country that still exists today. I'm talking about Zanzibar, an ancient island nation off the coast of East Africa, whose merger with the mainland territory of Tanganyika gave birth to the modern nation of Tanzania. Its story is a short but dramatic tale of revolution and unification. Zanzibar, consisting of the islands of Unguja and Pemba, has a rich and cosmopolitan history stretching back over a millennium. As a key port on the Indian Ocean trade routes, it became a melting pot of African, Arab, Persian, and Indian cultures. From the 17th century it was ruled by the sultans of Oman, and in the 19th century it became the center of a vast Omani empire and a notorious hub for the slave and ivory trades. In 1890 it became a British protectorate, though the Arab Sultan remained the head of state. In December 1963, Zanzibar gained its independence from Britain. A constitutional monarchy was established with the Sultan remaining in power, but the government was controlled by a coalition of Arab-dominated political parties. This arrangement was deeply resented by the island's majority African population, who had been historically marginalized and disenfranchised by the Arab elite. The political situation was a powder keg, with immense racial and economic tensions simmering just below the surface. The keg exploded just 1 month after independence. On January 12, 1964, a charismatic and obscure Ugandan-born revolutionary named John Okello led a few hundred poorly armed African rebels in an uprising. The revolution was shockingly swift and violent. The rebels quickly overran the island's police stations and seized control. The Sultan and his government were overthrown and fled into exile. The Zanzibar revolution had succeeded in a matter of hours. What followed was a period of intense violence and chaos. In the days after the revolution, thousands of Arabs and South Asians were massacred by African rebels in a brutal wave of ethnic retribution. The new revolutionary government, led by the Afro-Shirazi Party, declared Zanzibar a People's Republic. This sudden, violent, and leftist revolution on its doorstep caused alarm bells to ring in the west and in neighboring mainland Tanganyika, which was led by the moderate socialist Julius Nyerere. There were fears that Zanzibar could become a Cuba of Africa, a potential foothold for Soviet or Chinese influence. Nyerere, seeking to contain the radicalism and stabilize the region, quickly entered into unification talks with Zanzibar's new leaders. The Zanzibaris, for their part, saw a union with the much larger Tanganyika as a way to gain international legitimacy and security. The negotiations were conducted in haste. On April 26, 1964, less than 4 months after the revolution, President Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika and President Abeid Karume of Zanzibar signed the Articles of Union. A new sovereign state was born. The name of this new country was a portmanteau of the two that had joined together, Tanganyika and Zanzibar. And so Tanzania was created, and the independent state of Zanzibar vanished from the map, absorbed into a new, larger African nation. So there you have it, 10 countries, 10 stories of disappearance, from the slow crumbling of ancient multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, to the sudden, violent collapse of Cold War states like South Vietnam and Yugoslavia. We've seen nations absorbed by their neighbors like Tibet and Sikkim, and countries that split apart peacefully, like Czechoslovakia. We've witnessed the end of the Soviet superpower and the birth of Tanzania from the union of two smaller states. Each story is a complex tapestry woven from the threads of nationalism, ideology, war, and the simple, powerful desires of people for freedom and self-determination. What this journey shows us more than anything is that the political map of the world is not a fixed and permanent document. It's a living manuscript, constantly being edited, revised, and rewritten by the course of human events. The borders we see today seem so solid, so permanent, but as the 20th century proves, they can be remarkably fluid. Empires that seemed eternal can vanish in a few short years, and new nations can emerge from their ashes. It's a humbling and awe-inspiring thought, a reminder of the relentless and unpredictable nature of history itself. History is always changing, and so is the world map. Which of these countries surprised you the most? Were there any you had never heard of, or any whose stories you think deserve more attention? Let us know in the comments. Thinking about these vanished nations helps us better understand the world we live in now, and perhaps even to imagine the world that might exist 100 years from today. Thanks for watching.